On Target. My name is Carrie Raytheon, and I'm the director of ARMS here at UConn. Just to let everyone know, we are recording the meeting. So I have just clicked the OK button, and hopefully you will as well. Also, in addition, CTN, or the Connecticut Network, is also here, and they will be streaming this event and posting it on their website. So just to let everybody know, this is a recorded seminar today, which is great. We're excited for the interest. So On Target is an informal research type seminar where we, UConn ARMS, invite gun injury scholars to present their research to a wide audience. That includes fellow researchers, emerging scholars, policymakers, and of course the general public. And we view this as a core part of UConn's mission. Therefore, everyone with an earnest desire to learn about gun injury prevention is welcome here in this space. So today, I'm delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Jaclyn Schildkraut. She is presenting today. And since 2023, she has served as the executive director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium, of which UConn ARMS is a member, at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Prior to this appointment, she served as an associate professor of criminal justice at the State University of New York, or SUNY Oswego. She is also the editor of the Journal of Mass Violence Research. Her research focuses on school and mass shootings in the US, and part of her work is dedicated to understanding lockdown drills in schools. And today she will present lockdown drills from research to practice. I've learned a lot from Jackie on this topic. I've been grateful for her evidence-led approach in helping me refine my thinking and understanding of the evidence. I'm really looking forward to her talk today. I noted this already, but just to renote, we are recording this, and we are joined today by the Connecticut Network, or CTN, and they will be posting this seminar on their website. Our next On Target will be Wednesday, January 22nd, where we'll be joined by Dr. April Zioli. And then on February 11th, Dr. David Yamane will join us, who is here today. And I'll put a link to those events in the chat in case you would like to go ahead and RSVP. So here's how today is going to work. It's fairly informal. Dr. Schildkraut is going to talk for roughly 30 minutes or so, and we're gonna let her do that. If you truly have a clarifying question and just desperately need to ask because something just does not make sense, please, I think, feel free to interrupt her. But otherwise, let's hold all substantive questions for the end. We will have around 25 or so minutes for conversation. And if I know Jackie, she'll also be happy to follow up with anyone after to continue the conversation. So Jackie, it's all you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everybody who's joining today, especially as we are, at least on the East Coast, in the lunch hour. So I hope that you get something out of this. We can also lunch and learn, as they say. So I'm going to be talking about my research on lockdown drills. And what's particularly interesting is when Carrie and I were talking about what topic I should pick, and Mark as well, the executive order from President Biden had not yet come out. And as we know, on September 26th, he issued an executive order to address a number of issues, the state of active shooter preparedness efforts in schools being one of them. So I think this topic is particularly timely, and I look forward to sharing my work with you and also learning from you at the same time. So one thing that I do really want to start with is we should always be actively trying to prevent mass shootings, both in and out of schools. But unfortunately, we also know from all of the incidents that have happened that response may in fact be our reality. And so when we're really thinking about it in this space, it's not about prevention per se of the incident, but prevention of harm or harm mitigation. So if this happens, how can we make it as least impactful as possible? And part of the way that we do that is to standardize response. One of the things that we know from all of the different shootings that have happened is there's a lot of stakeholders that will become part of this event once it happens. And the more that we can standardize our response, the better that the overall response will be. So for instance, I live in a county where there are 18 different school districts, and each of these school districts are all doing something different. Yet if there was a shooting in any one of them, every law enforcement agency in our county is going to show up and probably then some. So if somebody's interested or is used to things being done one way in their school district, and then they respond to another school district where it's being done differently, that can sort of impede their response or at least make it a little bit more difficult. And so the more that we can standardize responses, it helps to improve the predictability of how we're responding, what people are walking into, and also what the people who are experiencing the event are also, coming to expect. So where we've sort of landed on this is lockdown drills. And I use the term lockdown drills really purposefully, because when we think about lockdown drills, there's a very specific set of procedures, or steps of a procedure, I should say, that an individual or a group of individuals will engage in. And that typically involves locking the door, turning off the lights, although please contact your local law enforcement. Some of them prefer you leave them on. Moving out of sight, so that means you can't be seen from an interior hallway, remaining silent so as not to call any attention to your location, and then also not responding to any door knocks or any other attempts to get into the location where you're at. Where we also hear language that is typically used synonymously but means something completely different is the phrase active shooter drill. And this is a very blanketed term that, excuse me, sorry, I'm running a bit of a cold, that doesn't actually apply to any one particular protocol. It doesn't have a standardized set of procedures. So when we typically hear the phrase active shooter drill, it's often referring to options-based protocols like the Alice protocol, run, hide, fight, avoid, deny, defend, or any of the other ones that are similar to that. And where there tends to be a big focus on that is because there is the misperception or the misunderstanding that when we talk about lockdown drills, we're telling people that that is their only option. And I can assure you that we are not telling them that is their only option. So for instance, if students get locked out of the classroom or you're in an open space, we're not like, well, lockdown is your only option. We talk to them about things like self-evacuation, which could be construed as the same as run, but it comes with more purpose and more procedural steps rather than being sort of these vague or fuzzy concepts. But taking all of it into consideration, what we know about, we'll call it active shooter preparedness efforts in schools, is that these practices are currently being used in 98% of schools across the United States, albeit in varying forms and functions. So every single state has different requirements. Our state requires 4 drills every single year. Arkansas, where I actually was just a couple weeks ago doing a training, they only require 1 per year. The states will mandate how many you're supposed to do in your school, but there is, again, a lot of variability in what procedures are being used, how the drills are being conducted, whether they are simple discussion-based exercises, an actual practical drill where you can practice what you're supposed to be doing, or as we've seen in, unfortunately, some instances, a full-scale simulation. The challenge, or sorry, I should say that the use increases after Columbine. And what's particularly interesting is if you read the Columbine Review Commission report, in a very, very tiny little footnote, it actually credits the procedure of lockdowns with saving lives on the day of the shooting, despite that the school did not have a formalized lockdown plan and they did not ever practice a lockdown drill or an active shooter drill before April 20th. The reason being, even though Columbine came at sort of the end of a spate of shootings in the mid to late 1990s, it wasn't to the level that we've seen it today. It also wasn't something we were watching unfold on television the way we're very accustomed to seeing it now. And so when the shooting happened on April 20th, 1999, the individuals who were killed or injured were outside of the building where the shooting started. And of course, it happened very quickly. There wasn't a lot of time to respond, or in the school within the library, which actually could not be secured. And then Dave Sanders, the teacher who was killed, was in the hallway. But within the building during the shooting, there was hundreds and hundreds of students and teachers who were actually locked down behind secured doors. And what's particularly interesting about Columbine is that unlike most shootings today, Uvalde being the rare exception, most shootings today are over in 5 minutes or less. But Columbine, due to completely different police practices in 1999 went on for about 50 minutes. And so you had two perpetrators with 4 firearms and about 100 improvised explosive devices, or bombs, if you will, and they never once tried to breach a locked door. And so that was one of the reasons why this procedure was credited. And so since Columbine, we've seen more and more and more schools develop and then practice similar plans. As I mentioned, I kind of touched upon a couple. There are a lot of different options out there. And the challenge is there's very little research about any of these procedures, what impact they're having on people who engage or participate in them, whether they're achieving their goal of harm mitigation. We really don't know anything. In fact, before the research that I'm going to share with you, when we look at research on lockdown drills that was conducted in conjunction or connection with an actual practice versus being just more perceptual research, if you will, there was only 2 studies before our study began in 2018. One involved 32 kindergartners and the other involved 74 students between grades 4 and 6. So not really large sample sizes, not enough to be generalizable even to their own schools, let alone the nation at large. So to basically kind of summarize the state of where we were when we started, we have 98% of schools doing something without actually knowing if it works or what it's doing to the people who are participating. And this is actually where I came in. And to be honest, it was a complete happenstance. I was not expecting to ever study lockdown drills. But in February of 2018, there was a shooting in my hometown of Parkland, Florida. And unfortunately, we lost 17 of our community members, 17 others were injured, and our community is just no longer what it was. And a lot of things came out that about what happened, one of which being that the school really hadn't prepared for anything like this. Teachers had very little training, students had none, they'd never practiced a drill. And it just so happened that 3 weeks or so after the shooting, I was hosting our spring school safety symposium at SUNY Oswego, and we had John Michael Keyes from the I Love You Guys Foundation as our speaker that year. His daughter, Emily, was the student who was killed at Platte Canyon High School in 2006, and he subsequently developed the I Love You Guys Foundation, sort of as her remembrance, but also to help schools prepare for, unfortunately, the very worst day or any bad day they face. And so he came out and gave this presentation, and the director of public safety for New York State's 5th largest school district was in the audience and came up to me at the end. And this is a very crude summary of the conversation, but it was, we want that, meaning their response protocol, will give you whatever you want, just don't harm our kids. And as a researcher, and I know Dr. Racian would agree with me, most schools do not open their doors and just give you the keys to the kingdom to do research. So it was very serendipitous that came out of a very tragic event. So to give you a little bit of context, I know you guys probably are aware of New York, but I give a lot of presentations outside of our state. And so I have to constantly explain to people that there's an entire state outside of New York City. And Syracuse is right smack in the middle of it. We're in the Finger Lakes region. It's very lovely. So the district itself has 30 plus schools. I say plus because there's a couple of alternative programs. Some we worked in, some we didn't, purely for safety. It was me, and I had 5 undergraduate research assistants. So safety first for everybody involved. But they go from pre-K all the way up to 12th grade. On any given year, it fluctuates between about 18 and 22,000 students. So we worked with the littlest of the littles and the biggest of the big, if you will. And there's 4,300 plus employees, and that includes faculty, staff, and administration, but it also includes embedded community partners who are consistently working within these buildings and also need to be prepared for anything that may come up. So I'm going to briefly, or I guess, let me talk about choosing the right fit. And then I just want to briefly kind of give you an overview of the study. I'm happy to answer more questions in depth during Q&A, but I want to leave that time for you guys. So when we went to choose the right fit, we landed on the I Love You Guys Foundations program. And even though that was what Tom, the director of public safety, wanted, we still really vetted everyone. And there was a couple of reasons why we chose this. The first was that it's all hazards emergency response. So we weren't hyper focused on the very worst day, which is also their rarest. This is all hazards, meaning we're preparing schools for any crisis that they may face in the given course of a day. We also chose this because, to be perfectly honest, this is what New York State was requiring our schools to be prepared for in terms of functional annexes, the lockout, lockdown, evacuate, shelter, and hold. So as I always like to joke with people, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We put a better poster and some branding on it, as well as some training. And then the third reason we chose it is because it was free. And a lot of schools today are very budget strapped and conscious, and also thinking about sustainability. And this program used a train the trainer model. So I'm a certified trainer. I went out and I trained people within the district to be able to train forward. And all of their resources are free. You can go on their website, give them an email address solely for the purpose of them knowing where their program is used and you getting updates, and you can download everything and plug and play, as they say. So to give, as I mentioned, a brief overview of the scope of the project, I should just note that when I started, we did actually a pre-survey with all of the administrator or with the building principals, and we found that even in this one district, they were all doing something different. So from our perspective, we were really coming in as a very blank slate to get everybody on the same page. So in that first year, we rolled out a 6-phase project, which involved 3 survey time points: baseline, then after the first drill, and then following training and the second drill. And so we did surveys with students grades 6 and higher, because that is what is methodologically sound, and it's very difficult to write a survey to anybody under 6th grade. I'll be honest, it's very difficult to write a survey to 6th graders. But we did that, and then we also did with with faculty, staff, and admin. And so they did their initial survey. Then we came in and we did a round of lockdown drills. And when I say a round, I mean 1 drill per building. And we basically said to them, just do what you normally do. We're going to collect our data behind you. Then we did a follow-up survey, which allowed us to then look at the effects of that initial drill on a number of different outcomes, both procedural integrity, that is, or I guess, well, for the survey, it was more the perceptions of the drills, but we also collected at every drill point data on procedural integrity. So how many steps were you getting right? What does skill mastery look like? Things like that. Then after the holidays, because nothing says happy holidays like me not putting you through a lockdown drill, we came in and we did assembly style training sessions like the one you see here. So if you recall from the poster a moment ago, it delineates what students are going to do and what faculty and staff are going to do. And so we trained them together to be able to further reinforce the here's what everybody's role is, and here's how you're going to work together to stay safe. And so that was actually a really good way to bring everybody to the table and also encourage discussion. So we held some of these training sessions in 24 days, because I can tell you that the girl from Florida knew nothing about snow days in K-12 schools. And then we came in and we did a second round of lockdown drills with a couple of minor modifications. Well, modifications, I should say. The first was we changed the drill call. So in the first drill, we just simply went very plain language. This is a lockdown. This is a drill. The second time we used language consistent to the standard response protocol. And in that second drill, we also, we ran the drill fully. So in the first drill, what we noticed is a lot of administrators and school safety team members were running out ahead of us to get doors locked, to be able to, for us to tell them they were locked, or to get them locked before we could tell them that they weren't. And in a real emergency, that's not going to work. The room has to be self-sustainable in terms of their response. So we took all of those people out of the equation. So the entire school locked down, and then my team and I ran the whole drill. And then we came in and did a final survey, which allowed us to look at not only the effects of multiple practices, but also what happens when you introduce this training component. There's a very big misconception that going through drills is training, and it's not. This, what you see in front of you, is training. That's where we teach you what you're supposed to do and why you're supposed to do it. And training is where you get to practice those steps. In our second year, which was 2019-2020, we came into works on reunification. And in the course of doing that, we were able to do an additional round of lockdown drills, so another 1 per building, to see if everything that we had put into place in the first year had kind of held. Then, of course, COVID happens, and we resumed in year 3 with changing drills or modifying the procedure to be COVID safe, if you will. And I can talk about that in case, there's another pandemic or concerns about keeping students safe when there's health crises. But we came in and did 3 more rounds of lockdown drills. And then Tom, who you can see on the far right of your screen, said, Jackie, you're so good at running lockdown drills. How about you do all 4 drills in each school? And I said, Tom, 124 drills this year? That sounds great. Let's go for it. So in years 4 and year 5, we ran all of the district's state mandated lockdown drills and continued to collect data. And so, as I mentioned, there was not a lot of research out there. And so we were really focused on trying to answer some questions, and a lot of different ones. And I'm going to talk to you about kind of some that came up that we were thinking about, some that we were like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And I'm going to start with perceived safety, because there is this perception that we are just like making students feel unsafe and everything, that their school isn't safe, that, a shooting's right around the corner. And I start with this finding always because of all of the amazing positive findings that we had in this study that I will share with you today. I had one initially adverse or negative finding. And so I always start with that because it's the one I took a lot of heat for. And that was, as you can see here, so the yellow bar, or the bar on the furthest left, is the pretest. So baseline, the middle is after the first drill, and then the furthest to the right, the lighter green, is after the second drill and the training. And as you can see here, students initially expressed feeling less safe. Bear in mind that this is on a Likert scale, so all of their scores are above neutral and trending towards agreement, but I can't change the data. They are what they are. They expressed feeling less safe relative to their perceived safety at baseline over the course of the project. And what's particularly interesting, I get asked a lot why I worked in Syracuse City School District, which is a very urban inner city school district where there's a lot of community gun violence, and they are very unlikely to ever have a Parkland or a Sandy Hook. And it came down to them being willing to open their doors. Of all of the school districts in our county, they were the only ones that said, hey, we want to do this work and we want to get better. And so we started to think about what would be making people feel less safe. And so one of the things we actually looked at was students' exposure to violence, because these are students who are not only being exposed to violence in the community, but also in their schools. People bringing firearms and knives and other weapons to school for protection. There's a lot of fighting and things of that nature. And so what we actually found in looking at this was that it was actually the exposure to violence that was more consequential to their safety going down. And actually their perceived safety would have decreased more had those drills not been happening, because they helped to offset the negative effects of the exposure to violence. When we were talking to faculty and staff, as you can see here, their perceived safety was high and sort of stayed high. They weren't really fazed by anything that we were doing in this drill. And we also looked at perceived safety. So the idea that, feeling safe and feeling prepared are two very different constructs, kind of the way as feeling fear is very different than perceiving something to be likely. And so when we looked at students, and we asked them how prepared they felt to respond in each of those 5 different emergency annexes, what you can see here is they actually went up. They felt significantly more prepared, especially with that training component introduced. And I'm going to tell you an embarrassing story. So I can't hear you. So feel free to laugh at me behind your computers. But my friends and I used to love to go down to New York City, and we would always go to Canal Street, and we would hear those magical words, Gucci, Fendi, Prada. And inevitably, we would follow complete strangers in the nation's most populous city to back alley rooms, secret, trap doors, all of these things under the guise of purchasing fake purses. One time, my friend Kim and I actually got into a white van with blacked out windows because they said they had Dior. I was 20 something. Trust me, 2024 Jackie is very horrified with old Jackie. But had I perceived any type of risk to myself, I wouldn't have engaged in those behaviors. Unfortunately, I'm here to tell you this story rather than being at the bottom of the Hudson or a plot line on Law and Order SVU. And so the reason I bring this up is it's kind of indicative of this idea of what's called protection motivation theory, that in order for us to engage in protective behaviors, there has to be a trade-off. Otherwise, we're sort of just going through the motions. And we actually published a study recently. We went back and retested this theory in one of the high schools and we determined that the trade-off between feeling slightly less safe and so much more prepared was literally that process at work. If students felt, 100% safe, it can never happen here sort of mentality, they wouldn't have taken the practices seriously. But because that perceived safety was going down for whatever reason, it helped to galvanize them to practice with more fidelity. With the faculty and staff, they also felt significantly more prepared to respond after going through training and the second lockdown drill. And what was particularly interesting about this is when you actually disaggregate it based on their role, faculty members specifically only reported significant gains in lockout, shelter, and hold because they were regularly practicing lockdown and evacuate. We have to do 4 lockdown drills and 8 fire drills in our state. So they were more confident in the things that they weren't regularly practicing in after going through the training. But with staff members, we observed during the actual practices that they were just completely, if they weren't with students, they weren't practicing. And so their gains came across all 5, but it also highlighted the importance of needing to talk to them about, hey, you guys have to be practicing too, because if a threat comes in, they don't really care about the lunch that needs to be made or the box that needs to be shipped. They just care about harming people. We had some other findings, and these are student specific. We haven't finished running the data yet on the faculty and staff, but we did find relative to fear of harm that students' fear of harm either at school or on the way to or from school actually decreased after going through the lockdown drills and the training. Their perceived risk of whether or not a school shooting could happen in their school also went down, statistically significant. It doesn't look like it, but it was. And then we actually, in a separate school district, tested anxiety and well-being, which is perhaps the most direct measure of psychological harm that we can get about drills. And what we actually found is that after going through a drill using trauma-informed best practices, their anxiety was lower and their well-being, so feeling calm, content, and relaxed, was actually higher after the drill as compared to before it. And these were data that were captured in real time. So we did their baseline or yellow survey a week to 10 days before they actually went through the drill. And as my team and I were going through and checking the school, we actually were dropping surveys on teachers' desks, and they took those surveys during debrief. So they were maybe 30 seconds to 60 seconds coming out of the drill. So it's about the most real-time results that you can get. We also looked at the effectiveness of drill, or we terms procedural integrity. So for context, my team and I would pair off with district security, and we would just scour the building. So we would break it up into areas, and everybody was responsible for their area. Of course, we moved around to help each other, but we had very specific criteria where we were checking. Again, is your door locked? Are your lights off? Can we see or hear you from the hallway? And are you going to respond to a door knock? And we checked every single door. It didn't matter if it was a bathroom, a closet. I can't begin to tell you where I have found people in 6 years. But the most important thing is, did you get out of harm's way? And so door locks here were always high, and they stayed high. Obviously, we would like it to be 100%, but for context, we only report on occupied rooms, and on any given round of drills, that's 15 to 1600 rooms that were occupied. So at 94% of 1600 rooms, I'm not 100% happy, but I'm pretty happy. What was particularly interesting is between drills 1.1 and 1.2, when you break this out at building level, even though we found a slight increase in most areas, we actually found that the elementary schools went down. And that was something we were able to address in training and in feedback, excuse me, because if you recall, I said initially they were running out ahead of us to lock the doors, but when we took them out of the equation, what we ended up finding is the teachers had become very reliant on the administrators to lock their doors, that they moved to turning off the lights and getting kids out of sight, but they missed the most important step, which is that door lock, which research and real world events shows us is the #1 life-saving device in an active shooter event, both in and out of a school. With lights, they were a little over half, and now we're trending around 96, 97% of everybody getting their lights off. It's usually just somebody forgets. The out of sight, this one, especially the 3 drills that say 3-1, 3-2, and 3-3, that was COVID year. So I do try to like ground that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because there was half as many kids to keep quiet. But initially it was just over half. And now, it's usually more that they're being heard. Kids have a really hard time being quiet. And they do get better, and you can kind of correct it in the moment. But, that's something we definitely want to work on. This last one was the one that really kept me up at night, which was knocking at the door. We would come in, and that was done to simulate somebody. It wasn't a hard knock or anything. It was just a very gentle knock, but was to simulate somebody trying to gain access to the room. Because once you get that door locked, you don't want to come back to the door, because then you're breaching your own perimeter. And in that very first drill, we had more than 1 out of every 3 rooms answer the door. in what you would expect, it was teachers opening the door and talking to me. In the really entertaining ones, it was teachers not opening the door, but yelling at me through the door that they couldn't talk to me because they were in a drill. And in the ones that really kept me up at night is they would let kids open the door and talk to me. And so that was something we really wanted to address right away. And as you could see, it went from over 35% to less than 1%. Bailey, to less than 1% of rooms. And again, it's usually somebody wasn't paying attention or they forgot and they just heard the knock and like Pavlov and my dog went to go open the door. We also graded them on perfect checks. So how many rooms in the school or what percentage of rooms in the school could get 4 out of 4. And we went from just over 1 out of every 4 to about 82% district wide. I actually had not one, but 2 schools get 100% perfect checks on 100% of occupied rooms. And the reason why this is so important, I've done some trainings with school safety personnel and they're like, you're such a data nerd. Like, why does this matter? And I'm like, because when you go from a school that had no rooms getting anything right or getting 100% right on their very first drill to 91% on their most recent drill, what that says is, hey, if the very worst day happens, they have the tools to stay safe. That's what we're really trying to instill in these practices. So one thing that I do want to just use the rest of my little bit of time is to talk to you about trauma-informed practices. Our results are not generalizable to every single approach that there is because there are so many. And we specifically used trauma-informed best practices embedded within the procedures that we carried out to make sure that we were preparing without scaring and empowering people to respond to emergencies. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. First, you have to have multidisciplinary teams who handle your school safety planning and conduct your drills. And this is not just school administrators and security. Having people like mental health representatives from your school is so incredibly important because if there are adverse reactions, they are the ones that are going to be helping those students or in some cases staff members. And also chances are they know who those people are going to be in advance and can make sure that they have resources in place to help them. Your custodial team, they are the unsung heroes of lockdown drills because they're the ones with the keys. So there's a lot of different people that you want to bring to the table to help plan. I'm so sorry, it's lunchtime at my house, so everybody's going nuts over here. Also use a progressive approach. I'm going to be perfectly honest, it is not best practice to have students, especially, but as somebody who's gone through very sensorial drills, really staff members don't need to go through it either. If they do, it should be on a strictly volunteer based only, with informed consent. But you don't necessarily have to always just go right to the drill. You can do classroom based or school based discussion, tabletop exercises, work up to the drill. Again, also using training is really important, but make sure that you're just working people into it. Also, part of that is using age and developmentally appropriate language. So I will be perfectly honest, when we conducted our lockdown drills, we didn't do them any different for the pre-K students than we did for the 12th grade students. Where the differences in those group laid was within the training. With the very little kids, you have their attention for 15 to 18 minutes if you're lucky. So we got them really involved with hand gestures and, talking it through in very, very basic plain language. We stripped out a lot of the content to just give them what they needed to know. But with the older kids, I did not do hand gestures because I was already getting hand gestures in return. But they could handle more information and more advanced information. So progressively, you want to kind of work that material in. I also, it's really important to plan for students with disabilities. It's really difficult to say to a room full of students in wheelchairs, get out of sight, right? So what does that look like? What are the areas of your room that are safest or best positioned? Are there other ways that you can create spaces, whether it's through paneling, bathrooms, whatever the case may be? What is your plan for getting people out of sight? We also have to think about students with social and emotional disabilities, right? It's not always a physical disability that we don't think about. I've walked into rooms with students that have very high social and emotional needs, and I've come in and they've been completely fine because their teachers and their aides already knew, hey, they don't like the dark, so we're going to give them headphones and an iPad, and they're super quiet. We had some rooms where, students just had a really hard time. We would work with the school to make sure that that room was checked first so that we could sort of partially release the students so that they were able to kind of, bring their temperature down a little bit. Schools for students with disabilities often have IEP plans, and you can also develop IEP plans that are emergency specific. So, incorporating emergency preparedness efforts and the tools and resources that students need is really important. Um, Using trauma-informed practices, I cannot stress this enough. I'm going to be perfectly honest. We ran over 500 lockdown drills in the course of our research, and there was zero complaints from parents about us traumatizing their children. Most of the trouble that I ever had in this district, unfortunately, was with the adults who all know a world before Columbine where this was not normal. So it's dealing with two competing mindsets of kids don't know any different, so they're completely fine. It's very matter of fact when you talk to them about drills. And with adults, it's not always the same. But trauma-informed practices, briefly, adults, you got to model calm behavior. If you're calm, they trust the practice. If you escalate and elevate, or you don't think that you're safe, they follow you right on up there. Making sure always to announce a practice as or a drill as a practice. You cannot let people think that they are in a real world emergency when they are simply practicing to build muscle memory. And also the debrief period. It's really unrealistic to come out of a drill and go, okay, everybody, back to learning like nothing ever happened. They were just sitting in the corner for 10 to 15 minutes in the dark. And so we actually transitioned them out through a debrief period where we encouraged classroom-based or location-based discussion. We allowed them to ask questions. They asked us questions, and it really allowed opportunity to exhale and bring the temperature down in the room before regular activities resumed. And also assessment is so incredibly important. I was a researcher. I was given a grant, so I was brought in and I created reports and a data stream and all of these other things because that was natural to me as a researcher. But what I've seen time and time again is assessment is so incredibly important because you're able to see what you need to work on, and then you can come back and reassess to make sure that what you put into place is actually working. So to just wrap up with some final key takeaways, and I'll send it back to Carrie for Q&A moderation. Always identify your successes. I was an outsider who came into this district, and I think if you are that person, even if you're internal, always telling people what they do wrong isn't really helpful. So it's really important to identify the successes. At the same time, you want to identify those improvement areas. What can people be doing better? But don't just identify them, offer them opportunities and suggestions. For us, that really came down to securing doors, right? So one of the things we would talk to schools about is when you can't lock your door, whether it locks from the outside and you can't get to that lock, or you don't have the keys because people are notoriously forgetting their keys all the time. What is your plan B? What is your backup plan? And so we would talk to them about barricading, but that doesn't work when your door opens outward into the hallway. So then you have to come up with plan C, sometimes even plan D. Happy to talk through some of those. Also, I can't stress enough, you've got to drill at inconvenient times. We were running 5 to 7 lockdown drills a day. So it was inevitable that we were going to run into people at lunch. But the reality is, if you're always conducting your lockdown drills at Tuesday at 9 a.m., you're never going to find out what your school's deficiencies are. Because when everybody's on Tuesday at 9 a.m., they're in their rooms and all they have to do is shut the door and go in the corner. That's not realistic. It's also not when research shows us that school shootings are most likely to happen. They are most likely to occur at times that correspond with arrival, dismissal, and lunch, when people are congregated together in large groups in open spaces. So drilling at those inconvenient times, bell changes, lunch, things of that nature, is really important because that helps you really figure out what your gaps are and what you need to do to overcome them. I've already mentioned that assessment matters. It's really helped to create a feedback loop. We have, 10 plus rounds of data on each school. It showed them their progression over time. It shows persistent issues, also shows all of the great work they're doing. Ultimately, what we've been able to show with this research is that skill mastery is possible, and also that we've been able to create a culture of preparedness. When I first walked into this district, and they'll tell you this themselves, so I'm not throwing them under the bus, it was an absolute disaster. No school was doing the same thing. No one knew what the plan was. It was very discombobulated. Now, if you walk into this district, it doesn't matter what school you walk into on any given day or time, you're going to get the exact same response, that very predictability we started out with. And so we've also empowered people to feel like they are ready to respond. And I think that that's something that we often really don't give enough credence to. I'm just going to end with one small kind of note. We sit about 2 hours from Buffalo. And when that shooting occurred back in 2022, there was an 8-year-old girl in that grocery store with her grandfather. Her grandfather, who graduated high school before Columbine and had never been through a lockdown or active shooter drill a day in his life. And when that shooting started, he had no idea what to do. You know, that fight or flight or freeze kicks in. But that 8-year-old who had been grown up going through lockdown drills got her grandfather out to safety. Ultimately, what we are teaching people by doing these exercises is how to make good decisions in bad situations by assessing what's going on around you. That is a skill that is applicable outside of the four walls of a school building, and something I think if we really reframe this discussion can help show why these are such empowering and important activities. With that, I would like to thank you for your time. So would Chloe, but she ran off. And here is my contact information. If anybody's interested, I'm sure Carrie will also send that out. But I want to thank you, and Carrie, I'll turn it back to you. Went a
Great,
little over
thank
time. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you. We will be happy to send our contact information out, but we only do that with your permission. Thank you so much for that presentation. I learned a lot. The transferability of skills is certainly an area for discussion. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions, and this is going to be fairly easy. Just, raise your hand in real life or using your Zoom hand. If you're going to ask a question, it'd be helpful to see you, but obviously, depending on where folks are, that doesn't work for everybody. So who would like our first question?
I have a bunch.
I
have a bunch of questions.
We give you the first question.
All
Maybe
right.
ask one and then we'll see. And
I
if
will.
folks are silent, we'll just keep giving it back to you.
So what I think was interesting, and that was not a part of your presentation, is, folks, security guards, things like that, that may or may not have access to weapons themselves. And you didn't mention it, and I don't know if that was a piece of the puzzle or if you decoupled it from the research, or can you share about that?
It was really not a part of our research, to be honest. Within this district at the high schools, they do have SROs from Syracuse Police Department who are armed. But the district also has its own internal security force. They're called sentries, and they are unarmed. From our perspective, where we were focusing on is from the civilian side. What can you do to mitigate harm if a shooting happens in your building? And one of the things that we know from all of the shootings that have happened is the importance of that door lock. There has only been 4 shootings. I say only, I don't mean to sound callous. It's not meant that way. But out of all of the shootings that have happened, there have been 4 instances where anybody has been killed behind a locked door. And in 0 of those instances, was it because any of those door locks failed? And so for us, and of course, the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission also had similar findings and recommended door locks as their number one thing that had to be in place, particularly when they secure from the interior and preferably without a key, because dexterity in crises is not good. And so for us, we were really focused on, teaching students and staff what to do, and we didn't really get into the armed versus unarmed part of it.
Other questions, or are we giving it back to Representative Comey? Kevin, you look like you have a question. I'm not going to lie.
Well, a small one. I mean, I thought it was very interesting. Thank you again for doing the work, and the presentation covered a lot of ground. I think you answered a lot of questions I had, especially around, impacting children with additional trauma by putting them through these kinds of drills and what that looked like. And so it was very interesting to see your first set of slides where you showed it looked like a very slight increase in feelings of not feeling safe.
It was a slight decrease, of not feeling safe.
A slight decrease in feelings of safety. Whereas you showed, greater increases, of course, in folks in their behaviors and their harm reduction behaviors. And so that was interesting, because if before this presentation, if you'd asked me, I would have guessed that effect would have been much greater than what you showed in your study. So I don't know if there's a question there, just a statement.
Well, thank you for that. And, I always, obviously I can't, it's so hard. Data tell one part of the story, right? And I always say to people, I wish people could see drills through my eyes, because it wasn't like I sent everybody out and I stood at a post and I just let them go. I was also there checking every single room from the littlest littles, as I said, to the biggest bigs, and when we would walk into the rooms with like the pre-K or the kindergarten kids, you talk to them in an age appropriate way. If again, I modeled calm behavior just like I would expect the teachers to. So I would come in and I would say, and always reminding them who you are, why you're there. So I'd be like, hey guys, it's Dr. Jackie. I'm here just to make sure you're doing your drill well today. You guys are doing a great job. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're doing okay? And I would inevitably get these tiny little thumbs go up with their giant smiles. And I'm like, okay, guys, we're going to stay in lockdown until you hear the all clear from your principal. And I would very calmly close the door and I would move on to the next room. It was all done very calmly. And I think that that's, we didn't come in with any of the sensorial techniques. We did not simulate a gunman. Nobody dressed up as a mock shooter. There were no sounds. There were no sights. There was none
Right.
of that. And so I think, I always say to people, we don't set schools on fire to practice fire drills. Why are we simulating active shooters to practice a lockdown drill? It's the same thing. We're just trying to build muscle memory.
Right. So I think that's important in your study. And I guess if you're publishing to talk about the way drills were conducted, because of course we have heard a lot of stories of those other drills that try to strive for realism, which is not exactly as you said. When we have a fire drill, we're not striving for realism and having real fire. So, I think maybe there are some lessons learned from that as well, to say, how do you conduct these drills in a responsible way in the school environment so that you don't traumatize the kids, who really all you're trying to do is to build, good skills should something bad happen.
Absolutely.
Jackie, I wonder if anyone has ever done, or if you've done like some sort of randomized controlled trial with any of this, to think about, right? Like if the feelings of safety were decreasing, but at the same time exposure to violence is increasing, like it's hard to net out that secular trend with just a pre-post. So I'm wondering if anyone has ever tried to do a study like that to try to deal with, those lurking variables.
Yeah. So, honestly, no. I think there's a couple of things at play. First of all, I've learned a lot from being around you and, other public health and epidemiological researchers. So we did not get taught about randomized controlled trial in my criminal justice project or, program. So we were not taught how to do that. For us, I'll be perfectly honest, when we came in, it was like Parkland just happened. We got to get everybody everything all at once. So then you worry about, withholding skills and things of that nature. We have tried to secure grant funding to do follow-up studies, and our intention, should we ever get funded, would be to do a waitlist control group, so that we're not denying them those same skills, but that we are at least getting something as close to an RCT as possible. I think that's probably the most ethical way to do it. But to this date, no, nobody has it. And I'll be perfectly honest, other than us and the other two studies, most people aren't doing any of their research in connection with an actual drill. A lot of it is asking college students what it was like in high school, or as we saw from Georgia Institute of Technology with Everytown, it was, we're going to analyze tweets, which the target population isn't even on Twitter. So you're not analyzing the people who are actually going through drills. So there's not a lot of actual research in connection with the practice, but I think that that's such an important lens to consider.
Thanks. Other questions?
I should say we were taught what an RCT was, just not how to do them. I don't want to throw my professors under the bus.
That's fair. They're tricky to do. I mean, I think the waitlist control is like a fine and like a good option. And I mean, it's also hard in a space where these are mandated, like, to think about like how randomization would work. But I think it helps to kind of deal with some of the questions that folks like Kevin have. And it's possible that you even like decreased, like it would have been worse had it not been for the drill, given external violence happening in those folks' lives. So I think it's the randomized controlled trial is just helpful for that kind of thing. But it's not always possible. Anybody else? Representative Comey, would you like to ask another?
So I am working on a committee and we're talking about school safety, and we're in relation to working with kids with disabilities. And so you briefly mentioned it, and I think you know, it's individualized, right? So but was there some and we all know that, like, we can make all the policies at the state level that you want, but if the procedures and the practice is not um being you know, held, being done correctly, then, or as expected, then the differences are going to be unknown. But I'm just wondering if there was something that you thought worked really well with the students, and I loved your you know, with the iPad and the headphones, right? I mean, that was a very specific thing, and I'm just wondering if there was anything else that you know, found that was a good approach when working with the students.
So I will be perfectly honest, you know, in a lot of respects, we relied on the school to handle that because, again, I was an outsider who didn't know any of these kids from a hole in the wall. I honestly still don't know them, which, you know, is kind of a bummer when I was with them for 6 years. But what I will suggest is, you know, again, as you mentioned, it's very individualized. So they were very little kids. You gave them Bluey on an iPad with the headphones, they were set. Other kids, you know, it's tactical, right? So they would put like the stress balls or the fuzzies or the fidget spinners in their safe zone. I am seeing more teachers with special needs students who are putting those resources in that area of the classroom so that they're already there already. But what I will say is one program that you could look at, it's called Especially Safe from Safe and Sound Schools. And it is specifically geared towards trying to develop and uncover best practices for students with special needs during emergency preparedness experts. And these are people who have the respective backgrounds to be able to make those recommendations.
And did you ever, there's, you know, a lot of talk over the years about go kits and things like that. Was that anything that played a role in your research?
No, we did not. It's individualized almost to the school district, what their policies are. So like I see respectfully, and I don't know how to make this not sound bad. I see a lot of the well-to-do suburban schools tend to have those resources and the time and the PTA to put them all together and put them up in the room. And then you see, you know, the very sort of resource-strapped urban inner city districts that's not necessarily their first priority. You know, but they're addressing it in other ways. So you know, some schools are turning towards like, so one of the things in a go bag is typically an attendance list, right? So that way you can make sure everybody's accounted for. Now there are phone apps that you can do that with. So like the Raptor technology systems lockdown drill app, you can actually account for people through a system, and that kind of speeds up the process. We're also seeing schools that are looking, rather than having go bags, they have stop the bleed kits. So they're teaching hemorrhage and bleeding control to both faculty as well as more advanced students, that if somebody gets harmed, they are able to stop the bleeding and hopefully stop the dying before law enforcement or EMTs can get in. So I've seen some of those. You know, we can make all of the suggestions and we can say to people, like, this is what you should do. Whether or not they do it, it's a whole nother thing. You know, for context, within this school district, one of the things that we did in the very first year is over spring break, theirs, not ours, we literally went through the entire district and checked every single door lock. And we found that about half of these 2,000 doors couldn't even be secured from the interior of the room. You did not have one master key in a school that could secure everything, like, you know, in one go. So, you know, even the more simple issues aren't necessarily fully addressed at this point.
And one final question, sorry, that's it, I swear, just one.
No, you're fine. You're totally fine.
I don't know what time we have left. The opt-out situation, did you have a lot of families that opt out, or some, or did you communicate to families what you were doing, like,
So, so here, I'm going to be perfectly honest. People have tried in our state to do an opt-out procedure and it's been vetoed. You can't opt people out of an emergency, so it's a little concerning that you would try to opt them out of preparing for an emergency. I'm sure that that's not going to be a popular answer, but Carrie will tell you I am nothing if not honest. What we did is our project was communicated to family members or to the families before we started. There was a lot of information and literature sent home. They could not be opted out of anything. In fact, the only thing they could really opt their kids out of was taking my survey, and only 2 people did that. We did opt out instead of opt in. And so with, here's the thing, because this also gets into communicating your drills. If you tell people when your drill is going to happen, then they are going to expect everything. Like if you say our drill is Tuesday at 9 a.m., you're never going to know what your issues in your school are, because on Tuesday at 9 a.m., everyone's in the corner with the door locked and the lights off and they're being quiet. What we did in our first year, keeping in mind that I was an outsider who had absolutely no relationship with any of these schools, is the schools were told Dr. Jackie will be there sometime within this 2-week window. They were not given a specific day. They were not given a specific time. When I showed up, and we did it. The parents did obviously not get advanced drill notification. Because the school didn't have it, they were given post-drill notification. So it's always really important to have a post-drill communication plan. After, with like the first year or so, once we had built that relationship, they didn't even get the Jackie's coming at this point. It's just Jackie shows up when she shows up. They never knew when I was coming. And that allowed us to produce more realistic results than, hey, she's coming at this day and this time. One of the things I think that we did really well to help keep the temperature down is, in addition to communicating how the drills were going to be conducted and things of that nature, is we also held training sessions. So we held open training sessions for the parents. They could come in and learn the protocol, see exactly how their kids were being trained, what they were being trained on. And every single year they got a handout sent home that said, here's a reminder of what your protocol is, that very much mirrored the classroom poster for the standard response protocol. I realize that every community is going to be different. I just think that there has to be a balance of telling them everything and telling them nothing, because if you just tell them everything, you're not practicing with fidelity and you're just not going to prepare people. You're going to effectively build complacency. Again, I know that's not a very popular opinion.
I will, yes, Jackie is a very honest person. So she'll tell you like what she thinks it. Jackie, so speaking of honesty, I'm wondering, so I have 3 kids here in Connecticut public schools, and I'm always curious about like telling kids whether or not this is really a drill or like what's going on, right? I've had my kids come home and say like, a bear was in the hall today and we were all really quiet when the bear was in the hall. Just like kind of super sweet and lovely, but I don't know how I should feel about that, to be honest. So what's your thought about sort of telling kids something to get them to, practice that muscle memory, but maybe doesn't have the same level of like concern as, we're practicing an active shooter lockdown or something.
Yeah, we always we just use plain language. This is a drill. And they were taught during training, this is a drill means it's practice, but we still practice like we play. So, that was what was really important. We had one instance, honestly, where the person who was reading my drill script forgot to say this is a drill. And I was like, back on the radio 2 seconds in, I was like, get back on that PA and tell them that this is practice, because I'm not going to stand here and let them think it's a drill. And if you're not going to do that, then tell them this is over. Like it's unethical, it's disingenuous, and it's harmful if you let them go through a practice thinking it's real. You want to have harm, that's where you have harm. So I think it's really important to make sure that you're communicating that it's a drill, and also to teach them that language beforehand. Just as an example, I was in one of our high schools the day after the Oxford shooting. And I was very, I called Tom and I said, there was a school shooting in a high school yesterday. Are you sure you want to do this today? He's like, we still have to practice. And when I walked into one of the rooms, these are kids who are on social media. They know what happened at Oxford the day before. And when I walked into one of the rooms, I had a girl sort of yelp because she was scared. And I said to her, I said, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? Kind of thing. And she said, I'm scared. And I said, that's completely reasonable. It's a very scary time. Bad things happened yesterday. But what I always do is I always defer back to what I taught them in training. So I'll say, remember what we talked about, that whoever comes into your room is going to have a key and they're going to tell you who they are. Well, remember who I am. I've seen you before. This is the key I have that I got from your principal. And within 30 seconds of me entering to exit this room, you saw their shoulders go from here to here, and you could feel the collective exhale. But that's, again, because we train them on what to expect, and we could go back to those grounding principles. So I think that I can't underscore the training enough.
Awesome. Thank you very much. This is all the time that we have. I know that many of us could talk about this for much longer, which is great because Jackie has an email and we have recorded this presentation, and we will disseminate this presentation along with Jackie's email to the registered participants. If you think someone could benefit from that, please feel free to forward that or be in touch with us here at UConn Arms. We're always happy to connect you to researchers in this area or a different area of gun injury prevention as best we can. So again, thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you again so much to Jackie for taking the time to do this. It was incredibly helpful. The link for our upcoming events is in the chat. In January, where we're going to have Dr. April Zioli, and in December, Dr. David Yamani. And then, we're going to plan something great for March and April too. So please feel free to join us and check out our website for additional events. And again, be in touch. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.